One thing also as a massive factor is how you're merchandising your site. You can do all the forecasting, you can do everything correctly. If you just decide to really take a different lane when it comes to how you merchandise your site, that's going to have a massive impact. Being overstocked is going to have implications, and being understocked means you're just going to be missing your ability to meet demand.
It's also the riskiest piece. You're taking a lot of working capital. You have some expectation about the future, but that future hasn't happened yet. And you're taking a lot of today's dollars into the biggest POs of the season and basically lining up for what then needs to be your biggest quarter of the year. As of today, August 13th, we're taping and we're chatting all things inventory. Right now, a lot of brands are either in early stages of placing POs. Maybe some have already placed depending on their lead times. That's definitely the case for some of the brands that we work with that have longer lead times on inventory. And then some are definitely coming up to that target of when they'll need to get those orders in, or at least have an idea of this is how much I need. So I think that's definitely a kind of focus right now for a lot of our brands. Before we jump into specifics, Liam, do you want to just give a quick intro on your side, like who you are, what you do at Aplo?
More so on the auditing of new brands, pitching them, bringing them on board, some hiring work as well. But as it pertains to this conversation, obviously, like you said, Jake, there's a lot of conversation right now externally as well with brands that were in kind of the discovery call process, or just, initially meeting them, chatting about what we might be able to do for them. A lot of that discussion is around, of course, inventory as we head into Q4, since it's a pivotal moment. If you nail it, you set yourself up well for Q4. If you miss it, there's a lot of implications. So yeah, excited to chat about it.
Yeah, for sure. I think any operator that we've spoken with, or any brand that, to your point, Liam, right now is kind of in Q4 planning, I think inventory is, I'm not going to say always, but for most brands, the most challenging piece of their kind of growth model, growth forecast, let's say. It's also the riskiest piece. And the reason why is you're taking a lot of working capital, you're putting that into what we would call a risk-adjusted bet, meaning that you have some expectation about the future, but that future hasn't happened yet. You have some expectations around what you think efficiency is going to look like, what you think spend will be, what you think, what that means in terms of demand. And you're taking a lot of today's dollars and putting those into an otherwise kind of illiquid asset. And then you're waiting for that moment when you can move through that inventory and get cash out. And that all works. That makes sense. But if Q4 is your biggest season of the year, then all of a sudden you're taking theoretically the most amount of available working capital you have into the biggest POs of the season and basically lining up for what then needs to be your biggest quarter of the year, right? And I think that's where a lot of brands can actually run into trouble from a solvency standpoint, from a working capital standpoint, because if you over forecast and your demand projections are actually too lofty, you can end up in a really difficult position from a cash flow standpoint come November, December, January, right? And I think that's oftentimes where we see brands over order, get overstocked because they don't want to be understocked going into something like BFCM. But again, whatever you put into that inventory, you have to be confident that you can pull back out in the form of turning that inventory over. So Liam, I guess what are your thoughts? What are some of the conversations you're having with brands around this? Because it's a big discussion. I think it's like, from my perspective, it's the one that I hear the most.
Yeah, no, I mean, like you hit on a lot of important points there. Like obviously demand spikes for many brands in Q4. A lot of brands can see like 30-40% of their yearly revenue if they're very, very Q4 dominant. As you mentioned, being overstocked is going to have implications on cash flow because of how much you probably had to put into actually purchasing that inventory. And being understocked means you're just going to be missing your ability to meet demand. And that can also have implications on actually meeting any sort of minimum requirements that you have as a business during that period of time. So there's implications on both sides. And I think like one thing that a lot of the conversations that I'm having with brands right now is just around how they're actually forecasting Q4. So like, what are you actually using as inputs to forecast? What do you expect demand to be like in Q4? Obviously, there's many factors that go into that. One of them is looking at last year's Q4 performance and just understanding like what type of lift you're expecting to see. But then you also have to overlay what type of offer are you running this year in Q4. So are you running a similar one to last year? Are you running a different one? If it's vastly different, obviously that's really risky because you just don't know how that's going to perform. And then you're basically building a forecast, but then running an offer that might perform completely differently than the offer you ran last year, which is going to have massive implications on the actuals. So that's something that we're talking about. And then just basically like your year-to-date trends. Really overlaying that as well and understanding where you're at this year compared to last year. And do you expect that to carry through into Q4? So those are some of the main things that I'm talking about with brands as it pertains really to like how they're going about forecasting, also how Aplo is going about forecasting for the brands 100%. That we work with to make sure that they're ready for Q4 as well.
Yeah, makes sense. You brought up something interesting around discounts, right? And offer strategy. Changing offer strategy year over year, maybe sometimes you need to, but it's also a really risky decision, right? Because you actually have some historical data that you can count on if you're running at least the same offer year over year. You can have something to comp to and work backwards from to say, like, even if efficiency is X and even if we spend at Y, maybe we can assume some amount of certainty from either a contribution margin standpoint or like how that offer is going to perform. Like maybe you can back into like a reasonable efficiency estimate or something like that if you're running the same offer. But if you're changing offers, you're changing a lot of variables that may be messing with your overall profitability model for that whole season without you really knowing how to even measure or extrapolate, if that makes sense. Like, I'll use an example. Let's say a brand always runs a really big blowout sale. So it's maybe like up to 50% off or something like that. That's their offer during Black Friday. So everything across their catalog, it's up to 50% off. And the strategy typically is like your hero products, your best sellers, you don't really need to discount those at 50%. So you'll discount those at maybe at 10 or 15. And then the stuff that you really want to turn and that you're kind of just getting rid of for the season, anything that's like, you've sold out all your mediums and larges and you've got only the extra smalls and the XXLs left. Those maybe you can mark down at 50. If you're not planning on reordering that inventory, you're really just trying to get cash out of that stock. Those you'll happily mark down at 50% and basically just move those units. So that's typically a standard up to 50 sale. A lot of clothing and apparel brands will typically run that, but not just clothing and apparel. Let's say now that same brand year over year wants to try 30% off for orders over 150. Okay, you can make maybe the math work and that might be a good offer, who knows? But you have no historical map to kind of assume whether that offer is going to perform nearly the same as up to 50% off. There's no historical creative to go out. There's like no messaging strategy that you can kind of point to and say like, oh, this. So it gets really tricky and it introduces this whole new variable that actually has like this cascading effect on your entire financial model, entire growth plan, even all the way down to your marketing calendar and, when and maybe how long you want to run that sale. Yeah. There's a lot of things that can go wrong when you introduce a new discount. And I'm curious, Liam, like how often that comes up in discussion. Because I know a lot of times we'll see brands do this where they'll comp year over year, but they'll comp on like different duration of the sale. So the sale ran, for example, like 10 days instead of 2 weeks, or the offer was different year over year, right? And they'll look at the month and basically say, well, like performance was down, performance was up. But again, like different things happened year over year, right? So I'm just curious what your perspective is there.
Yeah, I mean, I think what you're hitting on really is like, if you're planning inventory in isolation from marketing, you're practically guessing. Like at the end of the day, the marketing calendar has such an impact and really dictates like your SKU level demand during Q4. Which gets into, again, like if you're even one thing like that you're kind of getting me thinking about is, and this is kind of a bit of a tangent to your point, but it's got me thinking about this, is that a lot of times when you're going into Q4, a lot of the conversation is obviously around offer strategy and what you're doing, even on the paid side, how much you're spending, et cetera, et cetera. Like the acquisition component is a huge focus. I think what often does get overlooked actually is just what you're doing on the retention side as well. Like what are you doing on the email and SMS front? Because obviously if your strategy and marketing calendar for email and SMS this year is much more aggressive than last year, you're implementing new strategies in terms of cadence, et cetera, that's going to actually have a material impact on what you're selling through. Ideally, hopefully it works, So that's one thing that like you're just getting me thinking about on the email side is, every single year around this time, there's a lot of conversation about Q4 prep, inventory ordering, et cetera, marketing calendar, all of that. But what I think sometimes doesn't get a lot of light in this conversation is really the actual retention strategy. And what's funny is that people do change that pretty frequently. Like in my discussions with brands, a lot of times, whether you're working with an agency, in-house, et cetera, like people do actually change their retention strategy pretty frequently. Maybe they're doing more resends this year. Maybe they have a higher campaign cadence. Like those little changes actually amount to some pretty sizable outcomes when it comes to what you're selling through. So that's one thing that I think I'm more aware of this year when I am chatting with brands, is really also asking what's happening on that side. Like in years past, I think I was more focused on like the acquisition side. Like what's your plan? What's your offer? How much do you plan on spending, ideally in a good scenario, going into this period of the year? But oftentimes we would kind of somewhat overlook like what the retention strategy is this year versus what they did last year. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, Jacob, but that's one thing that I've been thinking a lot more about this year and just having more conversations about.
Yeah, and I think a reason that this is so important, what you're bringing up, is because it gives you like a safety net of like, more predictable more predictable contribution margin, basically. What do I mean by that? If you can forecast with accuracy returning customers, and most brands can do this through a pretty simple cohort analysis. If you can accurately predict what returning customer revenue looks like in the coming months, you can build yourself in sort of a margin of safety from a revenue standpoint, like what you can expect in terms of revenue from that cohort, what you can expect in terms of contribution margin from that cohort, and back into what demand looks like from just returning customers. And then from there, you can assess what are reasonable spend targets, efficiency targets, contribution margin targets on the new customer side to kind of compare against what you're doing or the revenue you have priced in on the returning customer side. And a lot of that, to your point, is driven through your retention strategy, which namely is like your email and SMS, direct mail, push notifications, things like that.
Like one thing also that I think is not necessarily overlooked, but it also has a massive factor is how you're merchandising your site as well this year compared to last year. Like that's a big thing too in Q4. That's obviously going to have a big impact, and obviously where you're sending traffic on the ad side. But if you're merchandising your site differently this year than you are last year, you want to take that into consideration going into Q4, because that again is going to have a big impact on what you're selling through. So curious your thoughts on that too, Jacob. Like that's one area that I think Aplo as a whole, we're getting into more and more conversations on the merchandising side now. It's an area that we really want to be more involved in from a discussion standpoint. Historically, something that we haven't been as closely tied to. Obviously, we have discussions with clients about it, but it's not something that we're really, really involved in. But what do you think about that, just the merchandising side? Because it's interesting, because it's like you can do all the forecasting, you can do everything correctly. But then this year going into BFCM in Q4, if you just decide to really, take a different lane when it comes to how you merchandise your site, that's going to have a massive impact. So I'm just curious how you think about that too.
Yeah, absolutely. So merchandising is probably one of the most underrated topics of discussion, I think, in all areas, whether it's ad account strategy, creative strategy, CRO, merchandising really is at the key, like at the core of all of those discussions. I would say it's also the toughest thing to get right or get perfect, let's say. If you have a collections page that you're sending traffic to that says up to 50% off or up to X% off, and the first product that someone sees or the first set of products that people see in that collection, for example, are your 10 or 15% off products, and nowhere within scrolling kind of distance are your up to your 40%, your 50% off products. It's not only a missed opportunity from inability to actually show the products that are 40% off, are 30% off, for example, in your best deals, it also might actually be a disincentive or kind of like a bait and switch sort of perception on the customer side who clicked the email, who clicked the ad, for example, to get to that page to only see that like, oh, the up to 50 sale doesn't have any product at 50% off, right? And the truth is, like, it's not false advertising. You do have them, but you've hid them on like page 3 or 4 of this massive collection. So I think that's like level 1 of merchandising, is just like understand the products that you really want to have showcased. And depending on how your inventory level fluctuates too, you may want to be reshuffling which products are actually, at the top there. Because you don't 100%. Want to have just like the worst products that nobody wants to buy anyway, that are conveniently discounted at 50% because you just want to move that inventory. Like, you want to have a healthy mix of products that people do care about, do want, kind of sell organically on their own. And then also products that, you're having trouble moving. Maybe it's a sizing issue if it's a clothing and apparel instance. Maybe it's just like, if it's a CPG instance, it's just a flavor that it was a test, didn't work, you're sunsetting it, you want to move it at a certain clip. So there's a lot of opportunities there to merchandise better on the collections page. The other part of the merchandising discussion is seasonality. Seasonality is a really tough thing to get right, because product mixes are often not static. Like, throughout the year, you've introduced probably some new products into your mix, which means if you try to comp what product sold last year to which product sold you think will sell this year, you might have actually changed what the mix was since then. And your trending products from the last 2 months, for example, are different than the trending products that were trending in the 2 months leading up to, for example, the BFCM moment. So that's another part that's really tricky. There isn't like a one size fits all, but you do need to have some pretty good real-time data and historical data to try to like arrive at a reasonable mix of products that you can expect to sort of sell through in that season.
I think what you're hitting on too, like, I mean, throughout this whole conversation, we talked about a bunch of different factors that go into actually forecasting this period of time correctly. I think it just goes to show as well that, like, it's really highlighting that forecasting is an exercise of giving yourself directional information and understanding like the possible scenarios, because with all these factors at play, being 100% accurate, if you actually get 100% accurate forecast going into Q4, like that is amazing. It's likely not going to happen very often. So at the end of the day, it's an exercise of just really providing directional information about, okay, this is a possible scenario. This is a possible scenario. This is a possible scenario. Are we prepared for these different scenarios if they arise? Because that's how you actually make sure that you have contingency plans as a business and you get through that period of the year sustainably for the business going into Q1. If you don't do that correctly and you don't look at it as an exercise of scenario planning, not just forecasting, then that's where you get into situations where you did not plan for the upside or the downside, and you have, massive issues as you go through that period of the year into Q1. And that then impacts the start of your 2026, your next year's. I think it's really important to highlight. And I think most people obviously are aware of that. But just really highlighting that because I think we touched on so many things that can actually impact your forecasts. So you just have to be prepared for the different scenarios.
I think that's really well said. The last thing I'll say is that most forecasts are wrong and some forecasts are useful. Love that saying, and it's so true. It's really about having more forecasts, more scenarios, I should say, rather than having the one perfect forecast, because in a complex system with many variables, even the slightest change to any one variable could completely skew what the end outcome will be. So it's more important to have a process of analyzing multiple scenarios, planning for those scenarios, understanding how those scenarios can occur, and then most importantly, like what will happen or what to do if those scenarios play out. And whether that's inventory planning, whether that's cash flow planning, whether that is building marketing timeline and understanding what the appropriate spend targets, duration of sale, even discount strategy should be. All of that should be done with multiple scenarios in mind.